What if the law wasn't there to protect you, but to destroy you? On a quiet night in Memphis, Maricela Tate, a black woman, is pulled over by two white cops. A routine stop, they claim. Minutes later, she's in cuffs, framed for crimes she didn't commit. But what they don't know? She's FBI, and she's about to turn the tables. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The summer night air in Memphis carried a thick, humid weight, settling over the near-empty streets of Midtown. The neon lights of late-night diners flickered, their reflections shimmering on the damp pavement. The distant hum of passing traffic from the main roads was the only company Maricela Tate had as she drove through the quieter streets, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. She should have felt at ease. She had just wrapped up a meeting with Vincent Reyes, her contact at the FBI, at the Hillcrest Cafe. The exchange had been routine, just another night spent gathering intel, piecing together a puzzle that seemed to shift every time she got close to a resolution. But something felt off. Her training told her to listen to that instinct, to pay attention to the way the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The sound of sirens cut through the thick air, growing louder behind her. A glance in the rearview mirror confirmed her unease. A police cruiser was trailing her, red and blue lights flashing. Maricela kept her face neutral, heart steady. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a light. There was no reason for them to stop her, at least no legal reason. She pulled over to the curb, letting out a slow breath before resting her hands on the steering wheel, fingers spread. She had handled situations like this before. Stay calm, stay composed. Let them make the first move. The cruiser door swung open and two officers stepped out. Officer Grant Pearson moved like a man who expected the world to step aside for him. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with a permanent scowl etched into his features. His partner, Officer Dwayne Riker, was younger, but his movements mirrored Pearson's, calculated, dominant, like they were meant to send a message. Pearson approached first, shining his flashlight through her open window. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration." Maricela nodded, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for the glove compartment. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Pearson exchanged a glance with Riker, then smirked. "Routine stop. Your car looks suspicious." There it was, the vague, empty excuse she had heard too many times. "Suspicious how?" she asked evenly, handing over her documents. Riker took them, flipping through as if he actually expected to find something. "Just answer the questions, lady," he muttered. Maricela tilted her head slightly. "I believe I just did." Pearson's smirk disappeared. His grip on his flashlight tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." For a moment she considered arguing, pushing back just enough to make them sweat. But she wasn't here to make a statement tonight. She was here to get home and continue her investigation. She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping onto the pavement. The warm night air clung to her skin, but there was an unmistakable chill settling in her gut. Pearson stepped closer, his voice lower now. "Turn around, hands on the car." Maricela took a slow breath. "I still haven't been told why I'm being detained." "You're resisting a lawful order," Pearson said, his tone cold. This wasn't about the law. This wasn't about anything she had done. This was about control, about power, and it was a game they thought she was going to lose. She turned, placing her hands against the car. "See, that wasn't so hard," Riker muttered as he patted her down, a little too roughly. She clenched her jaw, staring at her reflection in the car's tinted windows. The sharp click of handcuffs locking around her wrists sent a jolt of anger through her. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly. Riker let out a chuckle. "Lady, you have no idea." Pearson leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "Tonight you're just another nobody." Maricela remained silent, her fingers flexing slightly within the cuffs. They didn't know who she was. Not yet, but they would. A security camera from a nearby convenience store captured the entire scene. The footage would show the officers shoving her into the back of the cruiser. It would show her sitting calmly, her face unreadable. But if someone looked closely, if they really paid attention, they would see something else. Her eyes weren't filled with fear. They were calculating, waiting, because tonight might be the beginning of their game, but she would be the one to end it. Maricela sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room of Midtown Police Station, her wrists still aching from the tight handcuffs they had just removed. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of old coffee and disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the muggy night air she had left behind. A single metal chair sat opposite her, the table between them scratched and dented from years of abuse. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't her first time inside an interrogation room, but this was the first time she was sitting on the wrong side of the table. The door swung open. Pearson and Riker stepped inside, neither of them bothering to conceal their smug expressions. They moved like men who had already won. "You know the drill," Pearson said, dropping a thin folder onto the table with a dull thud. "Let's talk about what happened tonight." Maricela folded her arms. "That depends. Are you going to read me my rights first?" Pearson smirked, shaking his head. "You talk too much." "That's funny," she replied, tilting her head slightly, "because right now I haven't said anything at all." Riker chuckled under his breath, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Look, lady, you made this harder than it had to be. Now we've got some serious charges against you." Pearson leaned in, tapping the folder. "You resisted arrest, you attacked an officer, and we found something interesting in your car." Maricela didn't flinch. "And what exactly did you find?" The door opened again before Pearson could respond. A new figure entered the room, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a crisp suit. Ada Nolan Hayes. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. He carried himself like a man used to control, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning Maricela as if calculating his next move. He had the look of someone who rarely lost a case, and he intended to keep it that way. "Ms. Tate," he said smoothly, taking the seat across from her, "I'm Assistant District Attorney Nolan Hayes. I'll be handling your case." She said nothing, watching him carefully. Hayes opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, a grainy image of a black handgun resting in the passenger seat of her car. "Do you recognize this?" Maricela barely flicked her gaze at the photo. "No, because that's not my gun." "That's interesting," Hayes replied, lacing his fingers together, "because it was found in your car." Maricela exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "And how convenient for you that it was placed in plain sight." Hayes didn't react to the accusation. Instead, he slid a flash drive across the table. "We also have video footage from the officers' body cams. It shows you resisting arrest and getting aggressive with Officer Riker." Pearson smirked. "You sure got a temper?" Maricela leaned forward, her voice calm. "Then let's watch it." Hayes nodded to Pearson, who plugged the flash drive into a laptop. The video played on the screen. Low resolution, slightly shaky. It showed her standing beside her car, her posture stiff but not aggressive. Then suddenly the footage jumped. The next frame showed her jerking back, arms flailing as if she were resisting. A subtle cut, barely noticeable, but to the trained eye it was there. The footage had been doctored. Maricela's pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing even. She couldn't call it out, at least not yet. She had no way to prove the original had been tampered with. And if she played this wrong, she'd tip them off that she wasn't just another civilian caught in a bad stop. She turned back to Hayes, her expression blank. "If that's your best evidence, you should be embarrassed." Hayes didn't take the bait. He simply closed the laptop. "Here's the situation, Ms. Tate. We have evidence placing you at the scene, resisting arrest, and possessing an unregistered firearm. That's enough for a judge to deny bail. You'll be held until trial." Maricela raised a brow. "You're not even going to let me call my lawyer first?" Hayes smiled. Cool, measured. "Oh, you'll get your lawyer, just not tonight." Pearson and Riker exchanged a glance before stepping back. "Enjoy your stay, lady," Pearson muttered as they turned to leave. The heavy metal door shut behind them, leaving her alone in the cold room. She exhaled through her nose, her hands resting on the table. They thought they had her. They had no idea. The holding cell was small, lined with dull concrete and a metal bench that barely qualified as seating. A single light flickered above, casting long shadows along the walls. Maricela sat in silence, her mind working through every possible angle. She knew what had just happened. This wasn't a simple traffic stop gone wrong. This was a setup, a deliberate move to frame her. And if they had gone through this much effort, then she had gotten too close to something dangerous. But who was behind it? Hayes? Pearson? Someone else pulling the strings? Her biggest problem wasn't just proving her innocence. It was getting out of this cell in time to stop whatever was coming next. She leaned back against the cold wall, staring up at the ceiling. The courtroom was cold, not just in temperature but in atmosphere, detached, indifferent. The kind of place where lives changed with the stroke of a pen. Maricela sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped together, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing on her shoulders. She had been through interrogations, seen the insides of holding cells. But this was different. This wasn't an investigation she controlled. This wasn't a situation where she could flash her badge and walk out. She was on the other side of the law now. The courtroom doors swung open, and in walked Assistant District Attorney Nolan Hayes. He moved with purpose, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just another prosecutor. He was someone who enjoyed this part, the power of the courtroom, the ability to shape narratives with just the right choice of words. At the front of the room, Judge Edith Holloway adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room. She was a woman in her late 50s, respected but not untouchable. Maricela could see it in the way her fingers tapped lightly against the bench. She was calculating, weighing the pressure she was under. "Let's proceed," Holloway said, her voice steady. Hayes wasted no time. "Your Honor, the state formally requests that the defendant, Maricela Tate, be denied bail and remanded into custody until trial," he announced, stepping forward. Ms. Tate was found in possession of an unregistered firearm, resisted arrest, and displayed violent behavior toward two officers in the line of duty. Maricela didn't react. She had expected this. Hayes continued, his tone measured but firm. "Given the severity of these charges and the risk of flight, we believe Ms. Tate poses a danger to the community and should remain in custody." Maricela almost smirked. He was good. Too good. He was painting a picture, one where she was dangerous, reckless, exactly what they needed the public to believe. She glanced at her court-appointed attorney, a man who had barely spoken a word to her before the hearing. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat before muttering, "Your Honor, my client is willing to comply with all conditions of release. She has no prior criminal record, stable employment, and there's no evidence she's a flight risk." It was a weak argument, and Hayes knew it. "The state disagrees," Hayes countered, his tone sharp. "Given the circumstances of her arrest, we believe Ms. Tate is more than capable of evading justice. We request she remain in custody." Maricela clenched her jaw. If Holloway sided with him, she would be stuck. No access to the outside world, no control. Then a voice cut through the room. "Your Honor, I'd like to raise a concern about this case." Heads turned. At the back of the courtroom, Ava Jennings, a journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption, had risen from her seat. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "This is a legal proceeding, Ms. Jennings. I hope you're not intending to disrupt it." "Of course not, Your Honor," Ava replied smoothly. "But I do have some questions about the legitimacy of the charges." Maricela kept her expression neutral, but inside something clicked into place. She knew who Ava was. The woman had made a career uncovering police misconduct, always one step ahead of those trying to silence her. Ava continued, "I've been following cases involving the Midtown Police Department for some time, and this isn't the first questionable arrest involving Officers Pearson and Riker. In fact, there have been multiple allegations of fabricated evidence over the past year, all conveniently dismissed before reaching trial." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Hayes' jaw tightened. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant." Holloway held up a hand. "Enough. Ms. Jennings, unless you have concrete evidence, I suggest you refrain from interrupting these proceedings." Ava nodded, but her message had already been delivered. The seed of doubt was planted, and Maricela took note of something else. Hayes didn't deny it. Judge Holloway let out a breath, looking between the prosecution and defense before making her decision. "Given the circumstances," she said slowly, "I am ordering the defendant to remain in custody for another 48 hours, while additional inquiries into the legitimacy of the evidence are made. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. Maricela didn't move. She had expected worse. 48 hours wasn't freedom, but it was time. Time to figure out what was really happening. As she was escorted out, she caught a brief glimpse of Ava, watching her carefully. There was something else going on, and she wasn't the only one looking for answers. The precinct was silent when Maricela was brought back to her holding cell. The air inside was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. She sat on the edge of the metal bench, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying every detail of the hearing in her mind. Then, just as she was beginning to settle into the silence, a voice drifted in from outside the bars. "You're running out of time." Maricela lifted her gaze. Standing just outside the cell was one of the officers from the scene. Riker. His usual arrogance was gone. Instead, his expression was guarded, almost tense. She remained silent, waiting. "Your little journalist friend?" he muttered, voice low. "She should back off. Fast." Maricela studied him, reading between the lines. This wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. Something had shifted. And then, before she could ask anything, Riker turned and walked away. 2 hours later, Ava Jennings's name appeared on the local news. Not for her report, not for her questions in court, but because she had gone missing. The walls of the holding cell pressed in tighter than they had the night before. The air was thick with the lingering scent of bleach, but beneath it, Maricela could still catch traces of sweat and metal, an unshakable reminder that she was being held like a criminal. She sat motionless on the bench, back against the cold cinder block wall, her eyes locked on the ceiling. She had spent years undercover, slipping in and out of dangerous places, but now the danger had found her. Ava Jennings was missing. That meant whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just content with silencing one person. They were cleaning up loose ends. Maricela knew she had a choice to make. She could sit here waiting for the justice system to correct itself, or she could act. But acting meant revealing her true identity, her real identity. FBI Special Agent Maricela Tate. Codename Sable. It was a risk. If the wrong people inside this system found out who she really was, her chances of walking out of here alive would drop drastically. But doing nothing meant losing control of the situation entirely. She let out a slow breath and stood. The decision had already been made. That night, when the guards did their final round of checks, Maricela positioned herself near the bars, her hands resting casually on the cold steel. When one of them passed, she spoke low. "I need to make a call." The officer barely glanced at her. "You'll get your one call when you're formally charged." She smiled. "It's not that kind of call." Something in her voice made him hesitate. "I know who you work for," she added, lowering her voice. "And I know you don't want them knowing you're refusing me access to my contact." His eyes flickered with uncertainty. Midtown wasn't just corrupt, it was deeply corrupt. Half the people in this building owed favors to someone. "You get 5 minutes," he muttered, unlocking the door. He led her down the hallway, past rows of cells that smelled like old sweat and hopelessness. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Inside a small processing room, he handed her a phone. "No funny business." Maricela nodded and dialed a number she had committed to memory years ago. After 2 rings, a familiar voice picked up. "You shouldn't be calling this number." She exhaled, feeling a knot loosen in her chest. "I wouldn't if I had a choice." There was a beat of silence before Vincent Reyes spoke again. "You're compromised." "Not exactly," she said, "but I'm not far from it." He swore under his breath. "Tell me what you need." Maricela leaned against the table, keeping her voice low. "Ava Jennings is missing. She asked the wrong questions in court, and now she's gone. I need to know what happened to her." "You think Pearson and Riker are involved?" "They're dirty, but I think it goes higher." Another pause. "I'll see what I can find." She hesitated, then took the plunge. "Reyes, I need something else." "What?" "Proof." There was a rustling sound on the other end, then a sigh. "We just recovered an unedited version of the body cam footage from Pearson's unit." Maricela straightened. And it shows exactly what we suspected," Reyes said. "Pearson planted the gun in your car after you were already in cuffs." Maricela shut her eyes briefly, absorbing the information. It wasn't everything she needed, but it was a start. "I need that file," she said. "You'll have it." Reyes promised. But listen to me, Maricela. If you reveal who you are before we move, they'll kill you. You need to sit tight. Sit tight, she repeated. You and I both know Hayes is going to push for an expedited trial. I don't have time to sit tight. You need to be careful, Reyes warned. This is bigger than just Pearson and Hayes. Maricela's fingers tightened around the phone. I don't have the luxury of waiting. Either we take control of the narrative, or they bury me before I ever see a courtroom. There was another pause, then Reyes exhaled sharply. I'll send you what I have. But Maricela, don't get yourself killed. The line went dead. The courtroom was packed. The air hummed with tension, the kind that settled deep into people's bones. Journalists lined the back rows, their pens ready to scribble the latest twist in what had quickly become one of the city's most controversial cases. A few familiar faces from the community sat in quiet concern, while the front row held the usual mix of uniformed officers and lawyers, some there to witness, others to ensure things went exactly as planned. Maricela sat at the defense table, her wrists free of cuffs. Her hands rested flat on the smooth wood, but beneath the surface, she felt her pulse hammering. The weight of what was happening bore down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her innocence anymore. This was about survival. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Nolan Hayes straightened his tie, walking toward the jury like a man who had already won. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice even and confident, this is not a complicated case. This is not about corruption or conspiracy or some grand miscarriage of justice. This is about accountability. He paused, letting the words settle. The defendant, Maricela Tate, attacked two police officers while resisting a lawful stop. She was found in possession of an unregistered firearm, an illegal weapon that she had every intention of using. Hayes turned slightly, gesturing toward the evidence table, where the black handgun sat in a clear plastic bag. There's no question about what happened that night, he continued. We have video evidence, sworn testimony from two highly respected officers, and now we have even more. He clicked a small remote, and a large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage played, a shaky, grainy video from a body camera. Maricela standing beside her car, her face barely visible in the glow of streetlights. Then a sudden movement, a struggle, her body twisting as if she were resisting. The camera jerked violently before going black. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Maricela kept her face neutral, even as anger burned in her chest. It was a lie, a manipulated narrative. Hayes turned back to the jury. The evidence speaks for itself, he said simply. He let the silence settle before taking his final step. But let's talk about Ms. Tate. A thick file landed on the table in front of him. He flipped it open, pulling out a document. Over the last 6 years, Ms. Tate has changed residences multiple times, often moving without notice. Her employment history is vague at best, and despite having no official criminal record, there are gaps in her past that remain unaccounted for. He let that sink in. She is, by every legal definition, a flight risk. A few jurors exchanged glances. Then Hayes turned back to the bench. Given the totality of the circumstances, we believe Ms. Tate is a danger to this community and must be held accountable. He nodded toward the defense table, a silent challenge. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Maricela had expected a fight. What she hadn't expected was how well planned it was. The video, the emphasis on her unstable past, the carefully crafted character assassination. They were closing every door around her. Her defense attorney leaned over. We need time to analyze that footage. We don't have time, Maricela muttered. They're trying to bury me now. The judge cleared her throat. Does the defense have a response? Her lawyer stood, fumbling through his notes. But before he could speak, Hayes took a step forward. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call an additional witness. That wasn't part of the schedule. Maricela's gut tightened. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses. Proceed. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened and a man in a suit stepped in. The moment she saw him, she knew. They had planted someone. Hayes smiled. Your Honor, the state calls Officer Mark Grayson to the stand. A police officer, but not one she recognized. She sat up straighter. This was new. Grayson took his seat in the witness box, adjusting the microphone. Officer Grayson, Hayes began, Can you confirm your current position with the Memphis Police Department? Yes, sir. I work in internal affairs, more murmurs. Hayes nodded. And can you tell us what, if anything, you uncovered in regard to the defendant's background? Grayson cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral. I was given access to restricted files concerning Ms. Tate's past. Restricted. The word alone was enough to plant suspicion. Maricela gritted her teeth. Hayes leaned in. And what did you find? Grayson hesitated, just long enough to make it feel real. Then he said, I found multiple reports of erratic behavior in previous employment records. Complaints of aggression, several anonymous reports of violent altercations. It was all a lie, and yet Hayes had delivered it perfectly. Maricela knew the game. He wasn't proving anything. He was suggesting just enough to make people wonder. Judge Holloway folded her hands. Defense? Her attorney stumbled through a weak objection, but Holloway waved him off. Noted. The witness may continue. Hayes took a slow breath. Officer Grayson, in your professional opinion, does Ms. Tate's background indicate a pattern of violent behavior? Grayson hesitated just a fraction of a second. Again, just enough to seem thoughtful. Yes, sir. In my professional opinion, it does. They had built a perfect trap. The edited video, the fabricated witness, the missing evidence. They weren't just trying to convict her. They were trying to erase her entirely. And unless she made her next move carefully, they were going to succeed. The courtroom had never felt smaller. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation. The tension crackled like static before a storm. Maricela sat at the defense table, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her posture composed but alert. She had made her decision. She stood, ignoring the questioning glance from her court-appointed attorney. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, I'd like to represent myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom like a ripple. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses, her gaze sharpening. Ms. Tate, are you sure you understand the implications of this decision? I do, Your Honor. A long pause, then a slow nod. Very well. The court grants your request. A flicker of amusement crossed Ada Nolan Hayes' face. He turned toward her, hands clasped behind his back. That's a bold move, Ms. Tate, but it won't change the facts. She met his gaze. Let's find out. The first order of business was addressing the so-called evidence. Maricela walked toward the jury, taking her time, letting her words settle before she spoke. The prosecution has built their case on one key piece of evidence, she began, the body cam footage. She turned toward the screen where the video had played the day before. Let's talk about that. Clicking the remote, she paused the video at the exact moment she had supposedly resisted arrest. You see that? She said, pointing at the frame. Look at the way the image warps, just slightly. That's not a normal camera distortion. That's called a frame splice. She glanced at the jury, watching their expressions shift from certainty to curiosity. If this was an unaltered video, the time code would flow smoothly. But if you look closely, she zoomed in on the timestamp. You'll see a microsecond jump. A cut, a ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Hayes stood, buttoning his jacket. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is not a forensic expert. Maricela turned toward him. No, but the FBI is. A beat of silence. And then in the back of the courtroom, a man shifted in his seat. Vincent Reyes. He had arrived unnoticed, but now Maricela saw him clearly. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was a message. She had backup. Maricela let a small smile play at the edge of her lips before turning back to Hayes. You claim this footage is authentic. Then why hasn't the original, unedited version been submitted? Hayes hesitated. It was subtle, but she caught it. Because, she continued, if this video was altered in any way, the entire case against me falls apart. Hayes recovered quickly. If Ms. Tate has no further evidence, he said smoothly, then I'd like to remind the court that video footage isn't the only proof we have. He turned toward the jury. We have witness testimony from 2 decorated officers who had no reason to lie. And now we have an additional revelation. He motioned toward the officer's bench. Pearson stood, clearing his throat. We've recently uncovered connections between Ms. Tate and a known criminal enterprise. A sharp chill ran through Maricela's spine, though she didn't let it show. Hayes nodded. According to internal reports, Ms. Tate's history includes interactions with individuals tied to organized crime. In fact, she's been spotted meeting with known criminals multiple times over the past few years. A strategic pause, then a carefully placed question. So I asked the court, who is the real Maricela Tate? The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Maricela exhaled slowly. This was their counterattack. If they couldn't disprove her claims, they'd muddy the water. She turned to Pearson. Let me guess, she said, voice steady. This so-called report came from Internal Affairs? He smirked. That's right. She nodded slowly. And I assume these meetings were recorded? Silence. She took a step forward. I'm waiting, Officer Pearson. If I've been meeting with criminals, I'd love to see the evidence. More silence. Interesting, she murmured. Then she turned to Hayes. You see, Ada Hayes, I have met with criminals before, because that was my job. Hayes narrowed his eyes. Maricela faced the jury. I was an investigator. My work required me to meet with informants, to gather intel. So if these so-called reports are real, then where's the proof? The tension in the room shifted. Hayes exhaled sharply. Regardless, Ms. Tate has no counter-evidence to— Oh, but I do, she interrupted. Another beat of silence, and then she played her final card. The night before this trial, she said, her voice clear, a recording was sent to investigative journalist Ava Jennings. A few heads turned. The name still carried weight. This recording, Maricela continued, was from inside the Midtown Police Department. She let that sink in. In it, Officers Pearson and Riker can be heard discussing how to edit the body cam footage. She looked straight at Pearson. Would you like to explain that, officer? Pearson stiffened. Hayes straightened. Objection! Maricela raised a hand. Let me finish. She took a slow breath. The original body cam footage exists. The FBI has it. Hayes's jaw tightened. Now tell me, Maricela said, her gaze sweeping the courtroom, who should really be on trial here? The room erupted. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Order! But the damage was done. Maricela had flipped the narrative, and she saw fear in Hayes's eyes. The courtroom had never felt this suffocating. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made people shift in their seats, uncertain of what would happen next. Judge Holloway's gavel had barely silenced the room after Maricela's bombshell revelation, but the energy in the space was electric. Across the aisle, Ada Nolan Hayes was stone-faced, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. He was calculating, adjusting, searching for a counter-move. But this time, there wasn't one. Your Honor, Hayes said, voice measured, this is nothing more than a last-minute attempt to derail the prosecution's case. Ms. Tate has yet to produce this so-called recording. Maricela remained calm. Your Honor, the FBI has the original, unedited body cam footage, she said, turning to the judge. I request the court to allow their verification. Holloway studied her over the rim of her glasses. Then she turned to the prosecution. Mr. Hayes, is there any reason why the court should not grant this request? Hayes hesitated. Too long. Then he cleared his throat. Your Honor, introducing external evidence at this stage. Cut the procedural nonsense, Holloway snapped, her patience wearing thin. Do you object to verification of this footage? Hayes clenched his jaw. No, Your Honor. Maricela fought the urge to smirk. Holloway nodded. The court orders the FBI to authenticate the video in question. We will reconvene once this verification is complete. But Maricela wasn't done. Your Honor, she continued, her voice unwavering, there's another matter. All eyes were on her. She turned toward the back of the courtroom. Mr. Reyes, Vincent Reyes, stood from his seat. Dressed in a dark suit, his presence was a stark contrast to the uniformed officers lining the room. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a USB drive, and walked toward the bailiff. I have another piece of evidence, he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. This contains footage obtained through an ongoing federal investigation. Holloway raised an eyebrow. What kind of footage? Reyes met Maricela's gaze. The kind that shows exactly how far this conspiracy goes. The lights dimmed as the new video played on the courtroom screen. At first, the grainy image was difficult to make out. A dimly lit space, shadows shifting against warehouse walls. Then a figure stepped into frame. Pearson. A hush fell over the courtroom. The timestamp showed it was recorded just days before Maricella's arrest. In the video, Pearson paced back and forth before another figure entered, his face partially obscured, but his voice unmistakable. Hayes. Gasps rippled through the spectators. The audio crackled, then came through clearly. If we do this, I want guarantees. You'll have them. And the money? Already handled. Then Pearson's voice again, lower this time. And what about her? What if she fights back? A beat of silence. Then Hayes spoke, calm, assured. Then we make sure she never gets the chance. The video ended. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then all hell broke loose. Hayes shot to his feet. This is absurd, he shouted. This video could have been fabricated. There's no proof. Sit down, Mr. Hayes, Holloway ordered, her tone sharp. He turned to her, eyes wild, but before he could speak, she continued. The court orders an immediate inquiry into this evidence, she said, her voice echoing through the stunned room. And in light of this development, Officer Pearson and Officer Riker are hereby remanded into federal custody for further investigation. Maricela turned just in time to see Pearson's face drain of color. Riker sat frozen, his fingers gripping the table. Two uniformed FBI agents stepped forward. This is a joke, Pearson hissed, his voice barely audible as the cuffs locked around his wrists. Neither Maricela nor Reyes responded. The truth had already spoken for itself. Hayes was unraveling. His once confident posture had vanished, his suit suddenly looking too tight, his skin too pale. This doesn't prove anything, he murmured, shaking his head. It's circumstantial. Maricela watched him closely. He had spent the entire trial controlling the narrative. But now, for the first time, he was grasping at empty air. She leaned slightly toward him, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. I think you should start looking for a lawyer. The words hit him like a slap. His breath caught, his hands gripping the table, as if he could physically hold on to what was slipping through his fingers. Then slowly, he sank into his chair. And just like that, the once powerful ADA Nolan Hayes was finished. Outside the courtroom, the air was crisp, the tension lingering, but no longer suffocating. Maricela stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the weight on her shoulders finally feeling lighter. Beside her, Reyes adjusted his tie. You really know how to make an exit, he mused. She let out a small laugh. Comes with the job. He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the press gathering at the bottom of the steps. So, what now? Maricela followed his gaze. This was never just about me, she said finally. There's more to uncover, and I intend to find it. She squared her shoulders, then started down the stairs. The gavel struck once, then twice. The courtroom was silent. Judge Edith Holloway adjusted her glasses, her gaze heavy as she looked across the room. The weight of the case, of the revelation that had unfolded over the past few days, was evident in the way she took a long, measured breath before speaking. This court has reviewed the evidence presented, she began, her voice steady, including the original, unaltered body cam footage and additional recordings submitted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A pause, a moment of stillness. It is now evident that the charges against Ms. Maricela Tate were based on manipulated evidence, falsified testimony, and coordinated corruption within the Midtown Police Department and the District Attorney's Office. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of shock, anger, and vindication. Judge Holloway turned her gaze toward the prosecution table, where Ada Nolan Hayes sat rigid, his once pristine suit slightly wrinkled, his fingers interlocked tightly as if he were holding himself together. The court, therefore, has no choice but to dismiss all charges against Ms. Tate, effective immediately. A rush of whispers and gasps filled the room. Maricela exhaled, slow and controlled, but inside she felt a storm of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, a quiet, simmering anger. Holloway continued. Furthermore, given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, this court acknowledges the pending federal investigation against Ada Nolan Hayes, officers Grant Pearson and Dwayne Riker, and additional parties to be named. The individuals in question will be remanded into federal custody pending further proceedings. Pearson visibly tensed. Riker's face went pale, But it was Hayes who truly crumbled. The man who had built his career on bending the law to his will now sat trapped in its grip. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but nothing came out. FBI agents stepped forward. The clinking of handcuffs was the only sound as Hayes, Pearson, and Riker were led away. Maricela sat still, watching them go. The aftermath was immediate. News headlines flooded the media. Disgraced ADA caught in corruption scandal. Police officers arrested for fabricating evidence. A system exposed. How one woman stood against it all. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their microphones shoved toward anyone willing to comment. Maricela didn't stop. She walked straight through the crowd, the air crisp against her skin as she stepped outside. She barely made it 10 feet before she saw Ava Jennings waiting at the edge of the press line. The journalist gave a small nod. "Looks like you made it out in one piece." "Mostly," Maricela replied, her voice lighter than it had been in days. Ava smirked. "You realize you just cracked open one of the biggest scandals this city has seen in decades, right?" Maricela exhaled, glancing around. Protesters had begun to gather outside the courthouse, their signs bold. Justice for all, no more corruption, end police abuse. She turned back to Ava. "It was never just about me." Ava studied her, then held up a notebook. "So, you want to talk?" Maricela gave a small smile. "Give me a day." Ava nodded. "I'll be waiting." Later that evening, Maricela sat across from Vincent Reyes in a quiet booth at a small diner. "You're free," Reyes said, stirring his coffee. "That's got to feel good." Maricela leaned back, rolling her shoulders. "I don't think good is the word, more like unfinished." Reyes studied her. "You're not wrong. Midtown's just one part of the problem. You exposed a crack in the system, but there's more underneath." He slid a small envelope across the table. Maricela raised an eyebrow before picking it up. Inside was a badge. Her badge. "Come back," Reyes said simply. "We need people like you." She looked at it for a long moment, fingers tracing the edges. Then she glanced out the window. Across the street, a group of protesters marched, their voices loud but their purpose clear. This had started as a fight for her survival. Now it was bigger than her. Maricela exhaled and looked back at Reyes. "Give me a day," she said again. This time it wasn't a refusal, it was a consideration, a possibility. The next morning, as the city woke to the fallout of the trial, a small envelope slid under Maricela's apartment door. No return address, no name. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a photograph, a man in uniform shaking hands with a group of officials. She recognized him, a high-ranking officer, someone she had never suspected. Tucked inside the envelope was a single note. "Midtown was just the beginning. If you want the truth, go deeper." Maricela exhaled, staring at the note for a long moment. Then slowly she reached for her badge. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. And this time, she was ready. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about those who dare to challenge the system when it fails. Maricela Tate stood against corruption, not just for herself, but for everyone silenced by power. So what would you do if the law turned against you? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more gripping tales of justice, power, and the fight for truth.